Okay, this is a great example of a buyer qualification problem. As you start reading it, the buyer's identified a house on which you'd like to make an offer. The buyer's annual income is 60,000. His monthly recurring debt is 350. The lender will qualify the buyer using ratios of 28 and 36. What is the maximum housing expense that the buyer qualifies for? So in this particular one, first of all, as you started reading it, hopefully you recognize that it was a qualifying problem. And so you went ahead and started setting up your T-bars. Okay. And then your back-end ratio. Same T-bar set with long-term debt in the back end. All right, now, as I've often mentioned, just start plugging things in and hope something good happens. So let's try plugging something in. First thing we come to is his annual income, which of course we're going to divide by 12 so that we can get his monthly income. So housing expense is the variable we're looking for. And the way we're going to get there is $5,000 monthly income times 28% is the ratio. Notice the ratio is right here. Okay. 5,000 times 28% is $1,400. So we're actually finished with the front end. So let's go solve the back end now and see what happens. Remember, the variable that we're looking for is the housing expense. To get there, we're going to add in his long-term debt of 350 given. His income stays the same. And remember, on the back end, it's going to be a slightly higher ratio because it includes all his debt. 5,000 times 36% is going to be 1,800. But remember, on the back end, on this problem, on the maximum housing expense problem, you have to get rid of the variable of the 350. So if we do that, we subtract it from both sides. And you will see that down here, he can afford a payment of up to $1,450. Now, what we're trying to choose from is between the $1,400 and the $1,450. The bank will allow him to have a maximum housing expense of one of those. And remember that in this problem, the maximum housing expense is always going to be the lesser of the two numbers, $1,400. Now, keep in mind, on the exam, you're going to have 4 potential answers here. I promise you 2 of them are going to be that one and that one. So even if you do it correctly, you still have to make the right decision between the 2 of them. Maximum housing expense, I question. Create your T-bars, fill in the blanks, hope something good happens. I will tell you, this right here is the only thing that people get tripped up on the exam when they're taking these problems. Okay, maximum housing expense. Continuing with our practice on qualifying the buyer, here's another problem, not radically different than the other ones that we've done. We're just going to make you work a little bit harder on this one. So when I start reading it and I see that it's a buyer qualification problem, I go to its bottom line. What's the maximum PITI? Another word for PITI is housing expense. So I know it's a qualifying problem. Obviously, we're not going to give you a header like this on the test. But having said that, it's pretty easy to recognize one of these when you see it coming. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my T-bars. Housing expense, remember, is another name for PITI. GMI is gross monthly income. And of course, the ratio established by the bank. And then the back end is exactly the same with one difference. And that's the long-term debt, which remember could be called recurring debt, or in this case, we just name what the payments are. GMI and ratio, it's going to be the same. All right, now let's start plugging some stuff in and let's hope something good happens. PITI is what we're looking for here. And another word for PITI is housing expense. So there's the variable that we're looking for, okay? And to get there, we're given the gross monthly income. But notice how we're given the gross monthly income. He makes $36,000 a month and his spouse has a monthly income of $850. So we're blending things here to kind of confuse you. His annual income of 36,000, we'll divide that by 12 to see that he actually makes $3,000 per month, and his spouse adds $850 to it. So between the two of them, they make $38.50 per month. $38.50 per month. And the bank is setting them up on a 28% ratio, fairly standard for conventional loans for our purposes. Okay. And of course, we're looking for housing expense. So with this one step, we're actually finished with the front end of this. 3850 times, what's that, 28%, is 1,078. So based on the front end ratio, he can afford a housing expense of 1,078. But the fact of the matter is, we know that this is America, so we know that people are running around with a lot of what I call back end debt. So his back end debt is going to be $199 for his car payment, $150 for his student loan payment. If I did my math right, that's $349. Now, just as an FYI on this, when it comes to recurring debt or long-term debt, if the problem tells you that it can be paid off by making regular payments within 6 months, our rule is 6 months, then it doesn't count as long-term debt. The bank looks at it like by the time you start making your payments, you're going to have that paid off anyway. So if we don't tell you, as the case is here, then you're to assume it's greater than 6 months. You would only take that into consideration if we said that the car payment was paid off in 4 months or something to that effect. Okay, so let's finish the back end down here. We now know what their monthly income to 3850, that stays consistent. Okay, now back end ratio is going to be a little bit higher to allow for all debt, 36%. So let me remind you down here, this is the only tricky part of this problem. 3850 times 0.36 is 1386. However, remember, when you're doing the maximum housing expense on the back end, you subtract out the long-term debt because you're trying to isolate the housing expense right here. So 1386 minus the long-term debt of 349, in housing expense he can afford up to 1,037. Now the lender has looked at his relationship to his income. He's looked at the relationship to the housing expense to the total debt. And when it's a maximum housing expense, you take the lower of the two. This one is just slightly lower. 1,037 is the answer to this problem. There's no doubt in my mind that 1,078 would be another one of the options, but you have to be disciplined to make sure you pick the correct number. I pulled this question off an old exam that I had written. So at the time that I wrote it, I believed that it was complicated enough to ask on an exam. In other words, we don't need to ask you a question more complicated than this to see if you understand the discipline. So we're still in the maximum qualifying problems. How do I know that? We'll look at the first line. What's the maximum housing expense that the buyer qualifies for? Okay, so we're in good shape on that. The minute I know it's a qualifying problem, I set up my T-bars. If you're watching these videos back to back, hopefully you're getting almost tired of this because you're just doing the same things over and over. Housing expense on the back end plus long-term debt over gross monthly income times ratio. And then we start plugging things in, hope something good happens. His annual income is $7,000. By this point, we know where that goes. We divide it by 12 equals $7,000, and that's our gross monthly income. So boom, boom, we're in good shape. Ratios are 28:36. By this point, we know what to do with those. Okay. His taxes and insurance are estimated to be at $240 per month. Now, I want to stop on that for just a moment. That was completely put there to try to get you off base. The reason that you don't need the taxes and insurance in this problem are you're looking for housing expense, and housing expense already includes the taxes and insurance. So technically, you're not going to make any adjustment there. It's an interesting piece of information, but it does not help you in this problem. His recurring debt is $600 per month, but look at this. His recurring debt is $600 per month, but 185 will be paid off in 4 months. I don't know if you remember from the previous video, but we said anything less than 6 months, we're just going to subtract it out. So his long-term debt, instead of being 600, ends up being only 415, which is 600 minus 185. Okay, now we're right back to where we were earlier. All of our numbers are plugged into place. So now we just have to trust our calculator. 7,000 times 0.28 equals 1960. So on the front end, we've already found our housing expense. Okay. He can afford up to 1960, but this is America. So we have to take into consideration his debt. So 7,000 times 0.36 is 2,520. 2,520. But remember, we haven't accounted for his long-term debt yet. So let's get rid of it there. If we get rid of it there, we have to get rid of it here. Okay, well, this is interesting. In this case, his back-end number is the highest number. So remember, in the maximum housing expense question, what we do is we ask ourselves, well, the bank's going to take the most conservative position, so they want it to be a lower payment rather than a higher payment. Maximum housing expense, choose the lower of the two, and the answer to this question is 1960. So the thing that's interesting about this is this person apparently, in the bank's eyes, handles their debt pretty well. Otherwise, notice how in the previous problems, the back end has always been the correct answer. That means that somebody has too much debt. When the back end's the back answer, the correct answer, it means that they have too much other debt other than housing. So this guy's handling his debt pretty well. Therefore, he will be able to afford up to 1960 based on his income. Buyer qualification questions.